Well, I'm joined now in studio by former Taoiseach and EU Ambassador to the United States, John Bruton. He's written a book, it's called Faith in Politics. Now, one of the chapters in this book focuses on the 1916 Rising. Of course, we're now into the centenary year where there's going to be various events and, of course, commemorations happening. And John has a particular opinion on this. John, first of all, thanks for joining us in the studio. You say that as part of the 1916 commemorations, they should be remembered but not glorified. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the principle of legislative independence for Ireland after 40 years of entirely peaceful struggle had been conceded 2 years before the rebellion. In September 1914, Home Rule was passed into law. And there was no question of it being gone back upon. The implementation was being postponed because a war had started a month before for practical reasons. But even the Conservative Party in Britain accepted that Home Rule was on the statute book and was not going to be reversed. So you could argue that the principle that the 1916 rebellion was supposed to be about had already been conceded without a shot being fired. And you could argue, I think, and I would argue from that there wasn't any need to start a process that obviously led to a very large number of lives being lost.
John, you might just explain to us in further detail the significance of Home Rule, especially considering the time when it was enacted, the political backdrop, so many different things at play, but what it actually meant and what it did for the Irish people.
Well, Home Rule, which was passed into law in September of 1914, gave Ireland back the legislative independence that it had lost at the Act of Union in 1800. Now, it was short of what we got in the treaty in the sense that it didn't include the right to impose tariffs. It didn't establish a separate Irish army, although it did establish a police service. But it gave Ireland the right to make laws for itself, which previously were being made in Westminster. I believe that if that had come into effect, and it would have come into effect without violence, it would have been built upon, just as legislative independence when it was conceded to Canada and to Australia and to other countries like that from the Imperial Parliament. That led eventually to their complete independence without any violence. I believe that Home Rule, particularly bearing in mind that you would have had universal suffrage, men and women would have been voting, they would have looked for more and more and more independence peacefully and would have been conceded it in principle peacefully. And I think we would be a healthier, independent country today without the legacy of violence. Now, I'm not claiming that we would have had all 32 counties, because clearly a majority in at least 4 northeastern counties would not have wished to be part of Home Rule. But if they weren't part of Home Rule, they would have been under direct rule from Westminster. So there would have been no strawment, none of the discrimination that we saw in the strawment regime from 1920 up to the 1970s.
In terms of a Home Rule, I know when there was the centenary celebration of this, you said, I think it was at the Irish Embassy in London, you said, if there hadn't been an introduction of violence into nationalism in that demonstrably dramatic way in Easter week, there wouldn't have been a civil war.
Yes, I believe that once the gun was introduced into Irish politics, that is Irish domestic politics, I know there was a war on in which Irish soldiers were taking part in France, but once the gun was introduced into Irish politics in April of 1916, it was very hard to take it out again. Also, the way in which it was introduced on the back of a proclamation that was absolutist and fundamentalist in its declaration of right, compromise became more difficult. So if you have a situation where compromise is difficult and the gun is being used as the language of discussion rather than elections, you have the recipe that frequently can lead to a civil war.
In terms of the remembering of Home Rule being enacted, do you think that there was enough done about this here in Ireland to remind us of its importance and its significance?
Virtually nothing was done to remember on the 18th of September 2014 the enactment 100 years earlier into law of Home Rule. There was huge celebration in Ireland at the time in 1914. It was forgotten. And it was partly forgotten, I think, because it undermined the case for the 1916 rebellion to remember that, in fact, what they were fighting for had already been conceded without anybody dying. That was sort of a subversive recollection to have if you wanted to make a big fuss about the 1916 rebellion.
You said that we could fall into a trap where we'll mistakenly romanticise the 1916 rising. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there is a tendency at the safe distance of 100 years now to only remember the heroism and not to remember the people who suffered, the civilians who suffered, the unarmed police who were shot, the people who were shot at checkpoints, the civilians who died as a result of artillery. All those are too easily forgotten as we focus on the lives of a few heroes. And that's a mistake, because war isn't about that sort of heroism. War is mainly about suffering and deprivation and loss. And war should only be a last resort. I think it's very hard to say that the 1916 rebellion was a last resort to achieve Irish independence, when the principle of Irish legislative independence had already been conceded in the Home Rule Act a year and a half previously.
And finally, John, just to ask you then, how would you like the commemorations to take place? What do you think would be an appropriate way to remember what happened in 1916?
I would like to see everybody who died either in 1916 by name to be remembered. Whether they were the volunteers who died, and there were 80 or so of them who were killed, and some of them were executed, they should be remembered by name and their sacrifice honoured. But also all the children who died, the unarmed police who were shot, the armed police who were shot, and indeed the British soldiers who were shot and died in the rebellion, 1/3 of whom were actually Irish soldiers. They should all be remembered by name, and their families, as well as the families of the 1916 rebels, should be invited to come along and take part in some dignified remembrance of the sacrifice that they made, so that we remind ourselves, going forward into the 21st century, of how much warfare damaged lives for people in the 20th century, and resolve to ensure, as Christians who believe in the value and the sacred value of human life, that this is never done lightly again.
Well, John, thank you so much for joining us here on A Question of Faith on iCatholic.